Welcome to Pax Britannica. Season 4, Episode 12. Love Thy Neighbour. Welcome back to Pax Britannica. I'm your host, Dr. Samuel Hume. Last time, we covered how colonial society in New England adapted to the Restoration back in Old England, how the Puritan colonists reacted with various levels of disappointment, and how that had actual political consequences when certain colonies, like New Haven, were vulnerable in the colonial settlement. We also saw how the demographics of the colonies were putting strain on their societies. These colonies had been envisioned as exclusive, pure communities, and political power was centralized in the hands of the freemen, adult men who were full members of the colonial church. Membership was no easy feat. It required godly living and a verifiable conversion experience, testimony that the grace of God had been felt, judged by the church. But by the 1660s, a third generation of New Englanders were being born, and the strict rules around church membership meant that unless something changed, church members would soon be a tiny minority, and they would lose their grip over the colonies. At the same time that these internal problems faced the colonies, an external, existential threat was in the near future. Since the first days of the Plymouth colony, the relationship between the colonists and the local Wampanoag people were more or less friendly. There were tensions and disputes, but unlike the English experience in Virginia, where they fought 3 wars with the Powhatan Confederacy, New England didn't face open hostility from most of their indigenous neighbours. The exception was the Pequot War, and what an exception it was. It ended with the obliteration and genocide of the Pequots. For the next 37 years, there was peace. That peace ended in 1675 with the first shots of King Philip's War. The traditional understanding of King Philip's War is that throughout the 1660s and the early 1670s, relations between the Wampanoag people and neighbouring English colonists deteriorated. The Wampanoag, led by their sachem, or king, Philip, were increasingly angry with the expanding English settlements and their proselytizing of Christianity. In 1675, a Wampanoag Christian, John Sassaman, warned the Council of Plymouth Colony that Philip was planning to attack them, and then he was murdered by Wampanoag assassins, likely on the orders of Philip. His murderers were arrested and hanged by Plymouth Colony in June 1675, and Philip began attacking English colonists all over New England. For the next 14 months, a coalition of English colonists and native allies fought a grueling war with Native Americans allied to Philip. When Philip himself was killed in 1676, the war ended with the Wampanoag population devastated and New England cleared for further colonization. That is a quick summary of the traditional narrative, as laid down by colonists at the time and then built on in the 18th and 19th centuries. But in the last few decades, this narrative has been repeatedly challenged. The simple chronology has been made far more complex, and the causes and results of King Philip's War have been subject to some really great scholarship, particularly by Jill Lepore and Lisa Brooks. As we'll see in the next few episodes, the basic factors remain the same. English colonists were encroaching on native land, native leaders were concerned about the spread of Christianity. John Sassaman died, and the trial and execution of his suspected murderers were the first dominoes to fall. But there is far more to uncover beneath the surface. In these episodes, I will use the terms Indigenous, Native American, and American Indian, as well as referring to specific nations and communities like Wampanoag and Narragansett. I'll use New England to describe the region, though I'll refer to indigenous spaces with their Algonquin names, along with the modern English names as well, where possible. Let's start with the name. How we refer to an event dictates how we look at it. I'm sure I don't have to tell you this, just think of the English Civil Wars versus English Revolution versus Wars of the Three Kingdoms. each name defines the same set of events in a different way. This conflict is usually called King Philip's War, although it's sometimes called Metacom's Rebellion, or more rarely, the Indian Civil War or the Puritan Conquest. Each of those names frames it in a particular way. The Indian Civil War places the Native Americans as the primary belligerents and removes English colonists from the picture. The Puritan Conquest not only places the colonists back in frame, with their religious identity at the forefront, but it makes them the active, aggressive party, with expansionist intentions. In the Norman conquest of England, William of Normandy didn't accidentally conquer England. Metacom's Rebellion frames it another way, using his earlier Wampanoag name, emphasizing his difference from the Europeans as well as his role as a sachem, but also calling the conflict a rebellion, making English suppression of this rebellion defensive and justified. For someone to rebel, they have to first be a subject, but as we'll see today, Philip, or Metacom, certainly did not consider themselves subject to the English colonies of New England. The Indian War has also been used, as has the First Indian War, which places the conflict within a much longer history of violence between colonizers and colonized. King Philip's War has been challenged as well. Firstly, Philip wasn't a king, but a sachem. The English tended to view them as the same thing, since they were usually hereditary or passed through a family. But a sachem's political authority was very different to what the colonists imagined a king to have. Philip was his name, but not by birth. In 1660, both he and his brother had come to Plymouth Colony and requested English names as a gesture of friendship. The elder brother, Wamsutta, became Alexander after Alexander the Great. Metacom became Philip after Alexander's father, Philip of Macedon. War was also a controversial description for contemporaries. One of our key records comes from Increase Mather, who published a brief history of the war with the Indians in New England in late 1676, so soon after Philip's death, and while fighting was still going on out in New Hampshire. A few months after that, William Hubbard published the Narrative of the Troubles with the Indians of New England. Hubbard takes issue with anyone calling the conflict a war, because in his opinion, that gave it a status it didn't deserve. A war required a just cause, a conflict between civilized nations, as well as armies following the rules of war. These troubles had been unjustifiably started by a barbarous people who then carried out inhumane outrages and massacres. Hubbard and Mather were rival ministers, which certainly played a part in Hubbard's not-so-subtle jab at Mather's book. But even so, the first recorded use of the name, King Philip's War, came 40 years after the events. Thomas Church published the memoir of his father, Benjamin Church, who had led the party which killed Philip. The entertaining history of King Philip's War frames Philip as the chief instigator of the war, his death as the end of the conflict, and so the role of Benjamin Church as essential for the colonists' victory and the 40 years of expansion which it had allowed. In my opinion, King Philip's War still fits best, as long as we keep its issues in mind and are well aware that the conflict outlasted the man it's named after. I'll also mostly stick to calling him Philip, because he did adopt the name, and he appears to have used it for the rest of his life. Many of the Wampanoag figures we'll cover have different names at different times. Plus, most of our sources come from English colonists, who didn't spell English words consistently, never mind Algonquin names. In these episodes, I'll try to stick to the same name where I can. Before Metacom becomes Philip, I'll refer to him as Metacom. After, he'll be Philip. Over this next series of episodes, we're going to cover the causes, events, and repercussions of King Philip's War. When I first approached my research, I believed we'd be done and dusted in a single episode. But the more I read, the more detail I found, the more interested I became, and I realized I couldn't just gloss over these events. They tell us so much about the world of 17th century New England, relations between colonists and indigenous people, between indigenous nations, between English colonies, and how conflict between European colonizers and Native Americans would play out for the next 200 years. If we had to pick the most important cause for King Philip's War, the largest fault line between the colonizers and colonized, it has to be land. Both the colonists' never-ending hunger for land and the incompatible differences in how English and native society saw land ownership. Relations between the Wampanoag and the English had been relatively friendly for the past 50 years, since the Pilgrims arrived on the Mayflower. Once the English population of New England had been numbered in the hundreds and needed Wampanoag assistance to even survive. As the colonies of New England began to grow in population, the power imbalance between native and colonist began to reverse. By the 1640s and 1650s, the colonial population was in the thousands, and native communities were still recovering from the devastating epidemics of Old World diseases. Land-hungry colonists were increasingly willing to apply pressure to neighboring indigenous groups, and the methods of taking control of the land ranged from above-board purchases to coercion and outright fraud, and even the use of pigs. The difference in how the English and the Wampanoag saw land would be visible to the naked eye. A New England town was made up of divided and ordered farms. When a town was founded, its land was divided into lots, owned by the head of a household, usually the husband or eldest son. Usually, these lots were then subdivided into parcels, with designated spaces for the house, for cattle, for barns and stables, and for crops. Those crops were largely imports: lettuce and cabbages, turnips and onions, wheat, barley and rye, all planted in rows, with herbs and smaller crops in the house gardens. Corn, an American crop adopted as a staple for the colonists, would be planted at the intersections of these rows, or even in its own field. The land was husbanded, arranged on paper through words and deeds, and then forced into order by plows and oxen. Wampanoag crops were grown differently. Wampanoag horticulture was cyclical. Fields would be left untouched for years, allowed to grow wild before being burned to ash. The ash made the soil more fertile, and Wampanoag women would rebuild the mounds and replant the seeds, and the cycle would continue. To quote from Lisa Brooks' Our Beloved Kin, "By midsummer, the corn stalks likely reached towards the sun, tasseling, drawing bees to light among them. Beneath the stalks, squash vines would extend across the mounds, wide green leaves expanding to provide shade, blossoms beckoning to bees. From among the leaves, bean tendrils would spiral around the stalks, climbing towards sunflowers and sunchokes, delicate white flowers promising fruit. Working alongside the plants, the women would have coaxed soil up the mounds with non-invasive shells and hoes, ensuring the shallow corn roots were protected, not only by squash leaves, but their own hands." End quote. The Wampanoag looked at English towns and farms and saw the land forced into rigid shapes against its will, compared to their own settlements where plants grew together. Whereas, when the English saw Wampanoag territory, they saw a jumbled mess of tangled undergrowth, at best inefficiently worked, at worst abandoned and open for improvement along the ordered designs they favoured. Both approaches worked for the societies they fed, developed over centuries of practice, but each seemed alien to the other. Of course, the Europeans didn't only bring plants with them. Horses, chickens, cows, and pigs were among the animals colonists brought across the Atlantic. Each offered the colonists something of value. Horses were necessary for travel, cows provided milk and horsepower, cow power, for plows, and chickens, cows, and pigs were slaughtered for meat. These were essential parts of the colonial diet, but they were also, as Virginia DeJohn Anderson puts it, agents of empire. Because no less than the people who brought them, these animals were alien to the ecosystem of New England. Today, we'd call them invasive species, and special effort would be taken to avoid damaging their new ecosystem. Eurasian livestock had been selectively bred over thousands of years, and the plants they grazed on had adapted alongside them. European grass could be stomped or eaten down to nothing, but grow back relatively quickly, European cattle were used to roaming for food, grazing on grass and saplings as much as they could. American flora was used to different animals, mainly deer, who nibbled and sampled and then moved on. But when pigs and cows weren't properly fenced in, they would roam the countryside and find a feast. In the space of just a few hours, hungry livestock could devastate the carefully managed Wampanoag fields. As colonists expanded closer to native communities, complaints that English pigs and cows had destroyed their crops increased in number. Pigs were especially hated by indigenous people because they were tenacious. Even when the Wampanoag harvested and buried corn to store, pigs were more than happy to find and dig up these stores. And it wasn't just crops. Gathering wild berries and nuts was a usual role for native children, but pigs could strip a bush bare. Worse, they could be highly territorial, aggressively defending their territory, and pigs are more than capable of injuring or killing people, particularly children. Native complaints were often countered by colonists, claiming that their livestock had escaped from properly fenced pens, or, particularly if a settlement was new, they didn't have the manpower to fence them in yet. These are reasonable explanations, often valid, but not all these escapes were accidental or unwelcome. Indian complaints recorded how sturdy English fences seemed to be around their own crops, but how poorly fenced their animals were. Colonial assemblies did pass laws to require settlers to build fences around their livestock and to help their indigenous neighbours build their own fences. But these laws also forbade Native Americans from harming any escaped livestock they found, and instead demanded that livestock be returned to their owner, who could then be charged for any damage. Instead of wrangling aggressive livestock over miles trying to find its negligent owner, Native Americans would often take the path of least resistance, to retreat from their now devastated fields. Many, many times, the first steps of a new colonial settlement were not taken by the colonists themselves, but by the hooves and trotters of their animals, who, searching for food, unknowingly cleared the land for their owners. Colonists then moved in, brought their livestock with them, and events repeated a few months or years later, and the number of animals just kept increasing. Last time we talked about how the new generation of colonists were born between 1640 and 1660. The colonial population was growing, and this only added to the demand for land. As sons and daughters came of age, many wanted to move out of their parents' houses and set up their own farms. At the same time, as the urban centres of Boston, Plymouth and Hartford grew in size, not to mention the ballooning populations of the English West Indies, the demand for food increased as well. Many New England merchants made their living salting pork and beef and shipping them to other parts of the English Atlantic. Not only did this demand for meat lead to more pasturage, but it also gave a strong financial incentive to breed as many animals as possible. If the colonists wanted more land, they first needed to deal with the current occupants. Different views of land also extended to concepts of ownership, as well as gender and political authority. In terms of ownership, the colonists came to America with existing ideas. The owner of land could do with it what they wished. They could pass it on to their children, give it away as a dowry, sell it, rent it, divide it as they wished. Land ownership was established through the written word, deeds and signatures, mediated in law by legislation and courts, and then solidified through occupation and improvement of the land. From the very beginning, from before settlers even arrived in the region, English authorities claimed land they did not own. The charters which laid out the future colonies, issued by James and then Charles, envisioned this new world as ripe for English settlement. They were not unique in this, and we covered that in our first episodes of Pax. Since then, this assumption had not gone away. As we saw with the conquest of New Netherland, kings of England still granted claims of land, whether the people living in America were European or not. But from at least the 1640s, this assumption was shared by the colonial authorities too. In terms of political authority, the English and the Wampanoag once again viewed the world very differently. As we covered at the start of today's episode, the English translated the Algonquin word sachem as king. These men appeared to rule over their people, and the title was passed down the family, just like the King of England, but obviously smaller in scale. King seemed appropriate. But colonists looking to buy land were often flummoxed when these kings told them they had no authority to sell their people's land. The English also struggled to wrap their heads around the role of leading women in Wampanoag society. Usually, these women held the title of Sonsqua, interpreted by the colonists as squaw sachem and translated by them to queen or wife of a sachem. Just as sachem and king, Sonsqua and queen are not exact counterparts, and the English were often confused or surprised when dealing with these squaw sachems. Both sachems and Sonsquas were first among equals, whose responsibility was to protect the rights of their community. These titles were both inherited from family and bestowed by their communities. There were hard limits on their power, particularly over land. Brooks describes their role as, quote, "They were not ruling kings and queens, but rather ambassadors, hard-bodied diplomats who travelled to other nations, carried their community's deliberative decisions, communicated effectively and persuasively with other leaders, and travelled swiftly to return the wider deliberations home. Rather than singular authorities, they formed part of a leadership network, which also included councillors and elders." End quote. The different approaches to gender roles is also important to note. Wampanoag society was far from a matriarchal society, but women had a far larger role than the English were used to. For starters, women could inherit property under English law, but control of that inheritance passed to her husband once she married. Not so for the Wampanoag. In Wampanoag custom, there was no general assumption that a husband could dispense with his wife's land. Of course, every situation was different, and more than one husband tried to do just that. But confident Sonsquas could stand their ground against both overmighty husbands and encroaching English colonists. The Wampanoag learned the hard way that when settlers were given an inch, they often took a mile. For example, in the 1640s, Massasoit, great sachem of the Wampanoag, and his son Wamsutta, soon to be Alexander, received valuable goods in return for what they saw as granting co-occupancy rights to the colony of Plymouth within 3 large tracts of land. To Plymouth, they'd just purchased this land outright, and it was exclusively theirs to divide up and use as they wished. When native occupants complained, the settlers presented the written deeds, agreed with their sachems. Disputes over these titles had to be handled in colonial courts, and these institutions prioritized words on the page over verbal agreements. From the 1650s, Wampanoag leaders recognized that they had to work within these colonial structures, and some of them were exceptionally good at doing so. One of those was Weetamoo, one of Lisa Brooks' case studies, and Weetamoo is a great example of how the conflicting ideas around land ownership, land use, gender, and political authority clashed in New England. Weetamoo was the eldest daughter of Corbitant, the sachem of the Pocasset, part of the larger Wampanoag Confederation led by Massasoit. Her father had no sons, so upon his death, she emerged as the Sonsqua of her community. She led a village which neighboured Portsmouth, the first town settled in Rhode Island. In the traditional histories we talked about earlier, Weetamoo appears only on the brink of King Philip's War. Instead, as Lisa Brooks has found, she is an active player in the build-up to the war and within it. We get an insight into her life in a document dated 1651, which mentions Weetamoo, then named Namumpum. Massasoit, the great sachem of the Wampanoag, recognized her as his neighbouring Sonsqua and kinswoman. This is a fascinating document which establishes that Weetamoo's territory was part of a widely connected trade and relationship network. It also shows that indigenous leaders were adapting to the power of the written word. The deed lays out Weetamoo's rights over the land and her power to offer or withhold settlement rights to colonists. It also puts in writing that Massasoit had not, and could not, grant her land away. The document was signed by Massasoit, Weetamoo, and Wamsutta. As Brooks argues, this deed was meant to counter Plymouth claims to Weetamoo's land under their agreement with Massasoit. The great sachem was essentially laying out that whatever the colonists believed they had purchased from him, they couldn't have purchased any of Weetamoo's land because it wasn't his to sell. Soon after this document was signed, Weetamoo married Wamsutta, and her sister, Wutanakanusky, married his brother, Metacom. This was a marriage alliance, strengthening the bonds between the heirs of the great sachem to the Sansquas of Pocasset. Marriage was a significant bond in Wampanoag society, but, unlike their Christian neighbours, marriage didn't confine a man and a woman to each other for life. Not only could men have multiple wives at once, but wives could end a marriage when they wished. Weetamoo married at least 4 men over her life, and though 2 of these ended with the husband's death, she was fully capable of setting aside a husband when she wanted to, as we will see. In 1656, the Plymouth General Court, the colonial legislature, issued grants of land to several freemen, including members of the court. Following in the footsteps of a long-lasting tradition, this land included the territory of Weetamoo, but generously included the condition that the colonists had to acquire the consent of the native owners first. But then Weetamoo refused to sell the land, and the 1651 deed secured her from any claims derived from agreements with Massasoit. But they really did want this land. Some bright spark realised that the marriage between Wamsutta and Weetamoo could give the English an opening. Under English law, Wamsutta, as husband, would have control over his wife's inheritance. In 1657, members of the Plymouth Court, who had granted themselves the land, met with Wamsutta. They'd come to collect a debt that the sachem owed and was due that day. Since he couldn't immediately pay it, they presented a piece of paper, a bond. Once Wamsutta signed this, he would pay off his debt with some of his own land, as well as a chunk of his wife's. Wamsutta signed it, but informed them that he couldn't sign over Weetamoo's territory. It wasn't his land. The debt hung over the married couple for 2 years, at which point it appears that Weetamoo assented to the sale of the land, although it's a bit unclear. This approach was not unique to Plymouth, and colonists all over New England used debts and signed bonds to pressure sachems and Sansquas to sell or mortgage land. At the same time that Wamsutta was approached, a similar shakedown was happening in Massachusetts Bay. The Boston trader John Tinker made a series of loans to several Nashaway men, who were all bound by kinship ties to the Wachusett sachem Nanamecomoc. This was not Nanamecomocs debt, but the colonists understood indigenous society enough to know that the sachem was responsible for these men. Nanamecomoc came to Boston to negotiate, at which point he was arrested for failing to pay the debts. But this wasn't really about those men, or even Nanamecomoc. It was about his father, or rather his father's land. His father was Passaconaway, the sachem of the Pennacook. Passaconaway was an ally of the colony, he had been for years, but that didn't stop Massachusetts Bay holding his son in a Boston jail for 2 years. He was only released when Passaconaway finally assented to sign over a parcel of land that the colony wanted. Passaconaway was both a powerful sachem and an ally of Boston, but he'd been unable to free his son except by surrendering land. Weetamoo would have known about the imprisoning of Nanamecomoc and understood it was about claiming his father's land. Brooks points out that if Weetamoo approved the land sale to Plymouth in 1659, it was in this context of coercion. The networks which tied all indigenous groups together shared these experiences and complaints and lessons from their dealings with the strangers from across the sea. Whether it was news that a Narragansett field had been ravaged by English pigs, or the dramatic imprisonment of the son of a great sachem, information spread and grievances compounded. The ties between the colonists and Native Americans were under strain, but they hadn't snapped. Not yet. If you're listening to this episode on release, then it is less than a week until Intelligent Speech 2026. On Saturday, the 28th of February, a cornucopia of history podcasts will be offered. The history of Byzantium, the history of Persia, Totalis Rankium, Pontifacts, and many others, including me, will be giving talks and panels on the theme of companions and rivals. I'm on a panel discussing paramours and lovers, and I'll also be giving a talk on the rivalry between an uncle and a nephew, James Stuart and James Scott, rivals for the thrones of England, Scotland, and Ireland. The conference is on the 28th of February, and tickets are $30, unless you use the discount code PAX, that's PAX, to get 10% off. Go to intelligentspeechonline.com to find out more and buy tickets. I hope to see you there. Thank you to my Patreon House of Lords, which has been joined by Carla, Marchioness of Tweeddale, and John Dealey, Earl of Halifax. They join my existing patrons, including the King's favourites Mike Sanders and Jarrow Kotowski, Harold Hanson, Duke of Hanson, Steve Cloutier, Marquis of Hull, and Eli Cohen, Earl of Dartmouth. Thank you to all my patrons, who received this episode and every other episode ad-free. They also receive the monthly Britannica Gazette Q&A and a Patreon-only chat room. Go to patreon.com/Pax Britannica for more information. Thank you to Sounds Like an Earful for the interval music in today's episode, to my entire House of Lords, and to you for listening.